This is an informative video about the bones that form the orbit. The orbit is a bony cavity that surrounds the eye. The orbit contains the eye, muscle, nerves, blood vessels, ligaments, and fat. There are 7 bones that make up the orbit: the frontal, the sphenoid, the ethmoid, the lacrimal, maxilla, zygomatic, and palatine. The roof of the orbit is composed of 2 bones, the frontal bone and the sphenoid bone. The frontal bone comprises the anterior portion of the roof of the orbit. Behind the frontal bone are 2 frontal sinuses, one above each eye at the midline. The sphenoid bone comprises the posterior portion of the roof of the orbit. The lesser wing of the sphenoid bone surrounds the optical canal. The optic canal houses the optic nerve, which transmits impulses to the brain from the retina, which is located at the posterior portion of the eye. Behind the sphenoid bone is a sphenoidal sinus, which is found on the midline below each eye. The medial wall of the orbit is composed of the ethmoid and lacrimal bone. The ethmoid bone is a lightweight bone due to a spongy construction. This bone separates the nasal cavity from the brain. The ethmoidal sinus can be found directly behind the ethmoid bone, which is superior to the sphenoidal sinus but inferiorly to the frontal sinus. The lacrimal bone is located on the anterior portion of the medial border. This bone is the smallest and most fragile part of the face. The nasolacrimal duct, also known as the tear duct, is located on the medial portion of the lacrimal bone. The floor of the orbit is made up of 3 bones: the maxillary bone, the zygomatic bone, and the palatine bone, which is located on the posterior portion of the orbit. The maxilla makes up the larger portion of the inferior border of the orbit. The infraorbital foramen, which contain the infraorbital vessels and nerves, can be located on the maxilla. Behind this bone lies the maxillary sinus, which is located on the midline inferior to the sphenoidal bone. It is the largest of the paranasal sinuses. The zygomatic bone is found on the inferior border as well as the lateral border. This bone is important in the structure and function of the facial skeleton. This bone is the insertion point of the masseter muscle, which is responsible for elevating the mandible. The palatine bone is the last bone that makes up the floor of the orbit. It is found posterior to the maxillary bone of the orbit. The palatine bone also composes part of the hard palate. The upper opening in the posterior portion of the orbit is the superior orbital fissure. It is bounded by the lesser and greater wings of the sphenoid bone. The lower portion is the inferior orbital fissure. The greater wing of the sphenoid bone, the maxillary bone, and the palatine bone bound the inferior orbital fissure. These fissures allow for major vessels and nerves to enter the orbit. To review, the orbit is a bony cavity that houses and protects the eye. In the orbit are soft tissues that act as shock absorbers to the eye. The orbit is formed from 7 bones: the frontal bone, the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone, the lacrimal bone, maxillary bone, zygomatic bone, and the palatine bone. The optic canal and both superior and inferior orbital fissures allow for major vessels and nerves to enter the orbit.